He descended to the ocean floor on a routine assignment, expecting to see only sand and rust. Instead, he found a presidential car that was never meant to be there. When the diver opened the trunk, what was inside terrified him. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. He had never thought of himself as a discoverer. That word belonged to people who searched for something with intention, with hunger, with a clear image in mind of what they hoped to find. His work had always been different. He descended not to uncover wonders, but to inspect, to verify, to confirm what already existed or what was assumed to be there. Pipelines, submerged pylons, forgotten debris from construction projects long completed and even longer forgotten. The seafloor, to him, was not a place of mystery, but a place of records, a silent ledger where the consequences of human decisions settled and stayed. Years of diving had trained his body to move without drama. Every gesture was economical, every motion deliberate. Panic wasted oxygen. Curiosity wasted time. At depth, discipline mattered more than emotion. He trusted procedures, not instincts, and that trust had kept him alive in places where light barely existed, and pressure erased all romantic notions of exploration. The ocean was not interested in courage or fear. It responded only to physics. This particular assignment had arrived without urgency. A private consortium planned to lay a new communications line along a coastal shelf that had once served military purposes decades earlier. Before any drilling or anchoring could begin, the area had to be surveyed. The request was routine, almost dull. Scan the bottom, mark hazards, photograph large objects, report anything that might complicate construction. No mention of recovery, no hint of secrecy. Just another job, neatly folded into a calendar already crowded with similar ones. Still, there had been something in the briefing that lingered in his mind. Not a sentence, not even a word, but a pause. When the coordinator finished explaining the technical parameters of the dive, there had been a moment of hesitation, followed by a neutral remark that sounded almost careless. The area had seen unusual traffic in the past. Old things sometimes turned up there, nothing dangerous, nothing valuable, just old things. The way it was said suggested the opposite, yet no clarification followed, and no questions were encouraged. He had learned long ago that depth was a form of separation. Once submerged, the surface world lost its authority. Political noise, historical narratives, public myths all dissolved into muffled irrelevance. Underwater, a sunken object did not carry a reputation. Steel was steel. Concrete was concrete. A wreck was only a structure interacting with corrosion, gravity, and time. Whatever meaning humans had once attached to it had no effect on how it decayed. As he entered the water, the familiar transformation began. The first meters swallowed sound. The last traces of surface light fragmented and thinned until they became a pale suggestion rather than illumination. His breathing settled into a steady rhythm, each inhale and exhale measured, mechanical, reassuring. The descent line guided him downward, a thin tether connecting him to a world that already felt distant. At depth, the water thickened visually. Suspended particles caught the beam of his lamp, turning it into a cone of drifting specks that moved with deceptive slowness. Time behaved differently here. Minutes stretched. Movements felt heavier. Thoughts simplified themselves, shedding anything unnecessary. He checked his instruments, adjusted his buoyancy, and continued forward, scanning the terrain below. The seafloor revealed itself gradually, a muted landscape of silt and scattered debris, shaped less by intention than by accumulation. Fragments of metal protruded at odd angles, remnants of forgotten equipment, or structures dismantled above and discarded below. Old cables lay half buried like veins exposed by erosion. Nets drifted where they had snagged years earlier, ghostly and inert. Nothing unusual. Nothing unexpected. Then the shape appeared. At first, it did not announce itself as a vehicle. It was too large, too geometrically assertive to be natural, but its outline resisted immediate classification. Long, horizontal, with edges softened by corrosion and growth. He slowed instinctively, hovering at a careful distance, letting the beam of his light trace the contours without committing to an interpretation. Experience had taught him. As he moved closer, proportions emerged. The silhouette resolved into something unmistakably artificial, but not industrial in the usual sense. This was not a shipping container or a section of hull. The lines were deliberate, designed. The body was massive, broader than necessary, heavier than any civilian vehicle had reason to be. Thick pillars framed what had once been windows. The curvature of the roof suggested armor rather than aesthetics. Recognition did not arrive all at once. It crept in, resisted, retreated, then returned with unsettling clarity. He had seen this shape before, not in person, but in images, in archival footage, in carefully staged photographs where it was always surrounded by movement, by people, by ceremony. On the seafloor, stripped of context and color, it looked absurdly out of place. A symbol abandoned in an environment that did not acknowledge symbols. It was a presidential car. The realization felt intrusive, almost inappropriate, as if he were projecting meaning onto an object that had none left. He circled it slowly, noting details that confirmed what his mind already knew. The thickness of the doors, warped but intact. The reinforced undercarriage. The remnants of insignia, barely visible beneath layers of rust and marine growth, reduced to vague shapes that only suggested what they had once proclaimed. What unsettled him most was not the identity of the object, but its posture. It did not look like wreckage. There was no violent deformation, no evidence of impact. It rested on the seafloor with a strange composure, aligned almost parallel to the sediment, as if placed there deliberately. The surrounding silt had settled evenly around it, undisturbed by any sign of sudden descent. Whatever force had brought it here had done so with control. He examined the area around the vehicle, widening his survey radius. There were no scattered fragments, no trail leading away from the object, no debris field to suggest a crash or accidental loss. This was not how things ended up on the bottom by chance. This was how things were put away. For a moment, he simply hovered there, suspended between disbelief and professional detachment. His training urged him to document, to record, to report. His instincts, honed by years of silent observation, urged him to slow down, to understand before acting. The seafloor did not demand haste. It preserved without judgment, allowing time to flatten urgency into perspective. He thought about the world above, about how carefully such vehicles were tracked, guarded, retired. They were not misplaced. They were not lost. When they ceased to serve their purpose, they were dismantled, archived, or destroyed under layers of protocol. The presence of this one, intact and submerged, suggested a moment when protocol had failed or been bypassed entirely. The water pressed against his suit, a constant reminder of where he was and how little tolerance the environment had for distraction. He adjusted his position and approached the rear of the vehicle. If there was anything to be learned beyond speculation, it would be there. The trunk, unlike the passenger compartment, was less symbolic, less visible in official narratives. It was where things were carried, not displayed. As his light illuminated the back of the car, he noticed the condition of the trunk seam. It was damaged, but not sealed shut by deformation. Corrosion had taken its toll, but the structure remained accessible. The latch was intact enough to suggest it could be opened with effort. That realization carried weight. Objects on the sea floor rarely invited interaction. They endured it. He hesitated, aware that this was the point where observation became intrusion. Opening the trunk would cross an invisible boundary, transforming a found object into a revealed one. He considered the implications briefly, not in terms of legality or consequence, but in terms of responsibility. Some things were lost because they were meant to be. Some things were buried not to be hidden forever, but to be removed from circulation. In the end, it was not curiosity that guided his hand, but consistency. His role was to assess, to understand hazards and anomalies. This was both. He positioned himself carefully, secured his footing against the soft sediment, and reached for the latch. The metal was cold, even through his gloves. It resisted at first, then yielded with a muted shift that sent a faint cloud of particles into the water. The trunk began to open, slowly, reluctantly, as if time itself objected to the disturbance. As the gap widened, darkness gave way to the beam of his light, and the first glimpse of what lay inside reached him. Not debris, not tools. He paused, aware that whatever he was about to see would not belong solely to the object anymore. It would belong to him as well. And with that understanding, the seafloor around him felt less like a workplace and more like an archive that had just been opened, page by page, after decades of silence. The trunk did not open fully at once. It yielded a few inches and stopped, as if the years had installed their own restraint, a quiet resistance born of corrosion and pressure. He did not force it further. Instead, he let the moment settle, allowing the disturbed silt to drift away and the water to clear. Patience was not a virtue down here. It was a necessity. Objects revealed themselves only to those willing to wait. He pulled back slightly, creating distance between himself and the vehicle, and began to examine the space around it with renewed attention. What he had seen already demanded context. The seafloor was not an empty stage, but a surface that recorded movement and disturbance with subtle precision. A violent arrival left scars. A careless drop left chaos. This place showed neither. The sediment around the car was evenly layered, gently contoured as if shaped by years of slow currents rather than a single disruptive event. There were no gouges, no radial marks, no evidence of an object tearing through water and slamming into the bottom. The vehicle rested as though it had always belonged there, its weight distributed calmly, its underside partially embraced by the silt. Marine growth clung to it in a way that suggested stability rather than trauma. This was not the posture of wreckage. It was the posture of placement. He moved methodically, circling the vehicle at a measured pace. His light traced the underside, revealing reinforced plates thicker than most civilian structures he had encountered. The armor bore the same quiet decay as the rest of the car, but even rust could not disguise its purpose. This machine had been built to resist force, not surrender to it. The irony was impossible to ignore. Designed to survive violence, it had been delivered gently into obscurity. As he examined the rear axle, he noticed remnants of hardware that did not belong to the car's original design. Faint outlines where brackets had once been attached, now eaten away, hinted at chains or cables that had been removed or had disintegrated over time. The placement of these remnants suggested control, not improvisation. Someone had taken care to lower the vehicle, to guide it into position, to ensure it would not drift or tumble during descent. He followed these traces outward, scanning the surrounding area for additional signs. A short distance away, half buried and almost indistinguishable from the sea floor, lay a dense block of material that looked out of place among the softer debris. Concrete, perhaps, shaped crudely but deliberately. It was too isolated to be construction waste, too purposeful to be natural. Its presence reinforced the impression that the car had not come alone. It had been accompanied, anchored, persuaded to stay. The realization shifted something in him. The discovery was no longer about improbability. It was about intention. Accidents could be explained away, archived, rationalized. Intentions demanded interpretation. They carried motive, fear, calculation. Whoever had sent this car to the bottom had not been improvising. They had been concluding something. He returned his attention to the vehicle itself, studying the doors, the windows, the seams. The glass had long since fractured, but the fractures were uniform, almost restrained, as if the pressure of depth had done its work gradually. There were no signs of forced entry, no pried panels, no chaotic damage. The car had been sealed, preserved in a way that bordered on ceremonial. The thought unsettled him more than any hint of danger. He had seen wrecks where the violence of their end lingered palpably, where twisted metal seemed to remember impact. This car remembered nothing of the sort. It was silent in a different way, withholding rather than screaming. He considered the broader implications. Presidential vehicles were not merely transportation. They were extensions of an office, Roland fortresses designed to embody continuity and authority. Every movement of such a car was logged, guarded, contextualized. To remove one from the surface world without record required access and cooperation at levels far beyond logistics. It required consensus, or at least silence. The absence of any official trace began to weigh on him. He knew enough about history to understand how carefully such objects were catalogued. Even retired vehicles were accounted for, their fates documented. Museums displayed them as artifacts of leadership, stripped of function but heavy with symbolism. Scrapping was done under supervision. Destruction was witnessed. Yet this one had. He found himself thinking less like a technician and more like a reader encountering an unfinished sentence. The car was a punctuation mark without a clause, a conclusion without a story. Its presence demanded explanation, but the seafloor offered none. It merely held. He hovered near the front, studying what remained of the emblem on the grille. The insignia had been almost entirely consumed by rust, its details blurred into anonymity. Only the faint geometry hinted at what it once proclaimed. It struck him that this erosion was not merely chemical. It was symbolic. Authority, reduced to texture. Power, stripped of its audience. For a moment, he imagined the car on land, surrounded by movement, by people whose lives orbited its passage. Cameras, security personnel, aides, bystanders. All of that noise had once been attached to this object. Now it existed without witnesses, its significance eroded not by scandal or revelation, but by water and time. He returned to the rear and focused again on the trunk. The partial opening seemed almost deliberate in retrospect, as if the vehicle itself resisted full disclosure. He widened the opening carefully, mindful of the fragile balance between corrosion and collapse. The metal creaked faintly, a sound that did not travel far in the water but resonated within him nonetheless. The interior of the trunk revealed order rather than chaos. The contents had shifted slightly over time, but they had not been thrown in haphazardly. This was not the residue of panic or haste. Whatever had been placed here had been arranged with care, perhaps even with a sense of finality. Before examining the contents in detail, he paused again, his attention drawn outward by a subtle change in awareness. It was not a sound or a movement, but a sensation he had learned to trust over years of diving. A sense of being observed, not by eyes, but by implication. The seafloor itself did not judge, but it recorded. And records, once disturbed, had a way of attracting interest. He scanned the area once more, checking for signs of recent activity. There were none. No disturbed sediment beyond his own movements, no modern equipment fragments, no indication that anyone else had visited this site in years. The isolation was complete. Whatever this place held, it had held alone. That isolation deepened the weight of his actions. By opening the trunk, by documenting the vehicle, he was becoming part of the car's story, however unwillingly. The boundary between observer and participant was dissolving, and with it, the comfort of neutrality. He adjusted his position and shone his light fully into the trunk. The beam illuminated the edges of a worn leather surface, its texture still discernible beneath layers of decay. A suitcase, old but well made, rested against the back wall. It did not belong to the car. It belonged to a person. The distinction mattered. He did not touch it yet. Instead, he took in the scene as a whole, allowing its implications to form gradually. The trunk was not a storage space in the ordinary sense. It was a compartment of transition, a place where objects crossed from one context into another. Here, that transition felt deliberate, almost confessional. The more he looked, the more the car began to feel less like a vehicle and more like a vessel. Not a container of passengers, but of decisions. Choices made quietly, perhaps reluctantly, that had required removal rather than resolution. The seafloor had not claimed the car by accident. It had been chosen as the final custodian. He understood now that the question was no longer how the car had arrived here, but why it had needed to disappear so completely. What could not remain on land had been entrusted to water. What could not be explained had been allowed to sink. As he hovered there, suspended between the vehicle and the open water behind him, he felt the first true shift in the nature of the dive. This was no longer a survey. It was an encounter. The kind that did not end when one surfaced, because its meaning did not belong solely to depth. He knew that whatever lay inside the suitcase would not answer all the questions forming in his mind. But it would narrow them, sharpen them, perhaps make them dangerous. The car, without an owner, had waited long enough, and by opening it, he had accepted an obligation he did not yet fully understand. With a final check of his instruments and surroundings, he reached toward the suitcase, aware that the next chapter of the story had already begun, not on the surface, but here, in the quiet, where intention had been preserved more. He did not touch the suitcase immediately. Experience had taught him that the first impulse to reach forward was rarely the right one. Objects preserved by depth carried their own balance, one that could be disturbed too easily by haste. He held his position, allowing the water to settle again, letting the beam of his light rest inside the open trunk without intruding further. The darkness within did not feel empty. It felt contained. The trunk itself was larger than expected, deeper and more reinforced than that of any ordinary vehicle. Its interior lining, once designed to soften sound and absorb impact, had degraded unevenly, peeling back in places to reveal bare metal beneath. Yet, even in decay, the space retained a sense of order. Nothing had been thrown inside. Nothing had been abandoned carelessly. Whatever lay here had been placed with intent. When he finally reached forward, it was with a slow, measured motion, careful not to stir the silt that had gathered along the edges. His gloved hand brushed against the surface of the suitcase. The leather, though cracked and stiff, still held its shape. It had been a quality piece once, chosen not for fashion but for endurance. The kind of object a person selected when they expected to carry it often, perhaps across borders, perhaps through uncertainty. He adjusted his light and examined it more closely. There were no initials stamped on the outside, no visible markings to indicate ownership. The surface bore the subtle scars of use rather than neglect. Small abrasions, softened corners, a faint discoloration where a hand might have rested repeatedly. These were not the marks of luggage forgotten in a storage room. They were the marks of something that had traveled with someone quietly, persistently. He opened it. The clasps resisted briefly, then gave way, releasing a muted cloud of trapped particles that drifted upward like breath finally exhaled. Inside, the contents were arranged with a careful symmetry. Clothing, folded rather than packed, layered as though someone had wanted each item to be accessible without disorder. Shirts in muted colors, their fabric preserved enough to reveal they had once been well cared for. A jacket, heavier than the rest, its lining reinforced at the shoulders. Accessories placed deliberately along the sides, as if to keep them from shifting. There was nothing extravagant here. No indulgence, no personal flair. The wardrobe was functional, conservative, designed to blend rather than announce. It spoke of a life lived under constraint, where appearance mattered but individuality did not. He recognized the pattern instinctively. This was not how people packed for themselves. It was how they packed when they were expected to be someone else. Near the bottom of the suitcase, wrapped separately in a piece of cloth that had once been white, he found the ring. It was plain, unadorned, its surface dulled by time but intact. No engraving marked its interior. No date, no name, no message. It was a symbol stripped of context, reduced to form. He turned it gently between his fingers, feeling its weight even through the glove. It was heavier than he expected, not because of its material, but because of what it implied. A wedding ring was not an accessory chosen lightly. It was a declaration, a public claim to a private bond. Yet this one carried no evidence of a shared history, no personalization, no trace of a relationship beyond the expectation that such a symbol should exist. It felt less like a memory and more like a prop, something included to complete an image rather than reflect a life. He set it aside carefully, aware that its meaning extended beyond sentiment. In contexts of secrecy, normalcy was often manufactured. A ring could be proof of stability, a reassurance to observers that a man belonged to a familiar narrative. Married, grounded, predictable. The absence of engraving now felt deliberate, a way to avoid leaving behind anything that could be traced to a real person. Beneath the clothing, secured against the interior wall of the suitcase, was a folder sealed in plastic. Unlike the rest of the contents, it had been protected with care, wrapped and rewrapped to resist moisture. The edges of the folder were stiff, the material thicker than ordinary paper. He recognized the look immediately. This was documentation meant to survive. He removed it and held it closer to the light. The plastic crinkled faintly, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the surrounding silence. Inside were medical records. Not summaries, not discharge notes, but detailed reports spanning years. Dates, procedures, assessments, follow-ups. The language was clinical, precise, written by multiple hands across different institutions. The consistency was striking. This was not the record of emergency care or incidental treatment. The name printed at the top of each document stopped him. It was a complete name, formatted correctly, accompanied by identification numbers, signatures, and institutional seals. On paper, it was undeniably real. Yet, as he read further, a strange absence made itself known. There were no references to a place of birth that could be located, no next of kin listed beyond generic placeholders, no insurance provider, no civilian employer. Documents referred to the patient as if he existed entirely within the medical system and nowhere else. The more he read, the clearer the pattern became. The treatments addressed chronic strain, repetitive injury, conditions associated with prolonged stress and physical demand. There were notes about posture correction, muscular compensation, vocal fatigue, occasional references to surgical intervention, followed by long periods of monitored recovery. This was not the medical history of a man who lived freely. It was the history of someone whose body was a tool. One detail stood out among the reports: repeated emphasis on facial integrity, maintenance of symmetry, careful documentation of minor changes that would have gone unnoticed in an ordinary patient. This was not vanity. This was preservation. The records read like instructions for sustaining an image over time, minimizing deviation, correcting even the smallest divergence from a predetermined standard. He felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with pressure or oxygen. The pieces were aligning themselves with uncomfortable clarity: the suitcase, the ring, the records. They formed a portrait not of a powerful individual, but of a managed one. A person constructed to fulfill a role, sustained not for his own sake, but for the continuity of something larger. The name on the documents meant nothing to him, and yet that emptiness was precisely the point. A name that existed only on paper was safer than one tied to a real past. The man described in these pages had no childhood, no community, no history beyond what was required. He had been created, maintained, and eventually removed. He looked back into the trunk, seeing it now with altered perception. This was not storage. It was an archive of a controlled life. The car had not been transporting a president. It had been transporting a substitute, a figure meant to absorb attention, risk, and visibility while preserving something else, someone else, from exposure. The thought did not arrive as a dramatic revelation. It settled slowly, like silt after disturbance. The more he considered it, the more it explained. The careful placement of the car, the absence of chaos, the lack of official records. This vehicle had not been lost. It had been retired in the only way that guaranteed silence. He found himself wondering about the man behind the documents. Not about his role, but about his awareness. Had he known he was temporary? Had he understood that the life he inhabited was conditional, destined to end not with retirement or recognition, but with erasure? The medical records offered no insight into thought or consent. They spoke only of compliance. As he examined the final pages, he noticed a change in tone. The later reports grew shorter, more cautious. Observations replaced recommendations. There were references to increased risk, to diminishing returns. The language suggested concern, not for the patient's well-being but for the sustainability of the role. Eventually, the entries stopped altogether. There was no discharge summary, no conclusion, just an abrupt absence, as if the need for documentation had vanished along with the man himself. He closed the folder and placed it back inside the suitcase, arranging the contents as he had found them. This was not an act of respect, but of acknowledgement. He understood now that what lay before him was not merely evidence of deception, but of sacrifice imposed rather than chosen. A human life reduced to infrastructure. The trunk, once an unremarkable compartment, had become a confession. Not one spoken aloud, but one assembled quietly from objects that were never meant to be reunited. The seafloor had preserved them faithfully, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. As he sealed the suitcase again and returned it to its place, his attention shifted to the edges of the trunk. There, partially obscured by degraded lining, he noticed something he had overlooked before, a seam that did not belong. A panel slightly misaligned, its fastenings different from the rest. It was subtle, the kind of detail that only revealed its. He studied it closely, tracing the outline with his light. This was not part of the original design. It had been added, concealed deliberately, meant to escape casual inspection. The realization brought a new weight to the discovery. The confession was not complete. The personal life, the manufactured normalcy, the controlled body, all of it explained how the illusion had been maintained. But it did not explain why the car had needed to disappear so completely, nor why it had been burdened with such care. There was another layer here, one that moved beyond identity and into consequence. As he reached towards the hidden panel, he felt the subtle shift in the dive's meaning once again. What he had found so far spoke of deception and substitution. What remained might speak of motive, and motives, once uncovered, rarely remained contained. The hidden panel did not yield easily. It was not meant to. Whoever had designed it had understood the difference between concealment and protection. This was not a casual compartment for convenience. It was an intentional silence built into metal. The fastenings were recessed, placed where the eye would slide past them without recognition, where fingers would not naturally probe. Even corrosion had struggled to expose it fully, as though time itself respected the decision to keep it closed. He worked slowly, adjusting his position to avoid stirring the sediment that had settled inside the trunk. Each movement was deliberate, measured against the risk of damaging what lay behind the panel. The water carried every careless action outward, turning haste into complication. He felt, more than thought, that whatever this compartment held would not tolerate violence. It demanded patience, the same patience that had allowed it to remain undiscovered for so long. When the panel finally loosened, it did so without drama. There was no sudden release, no cascade of objects. It opened just enough to reveal darkness behind it, a deeper darkness than the rest of the trunk, as if this space had been insulated not only from water, but from history itself. He directed his light inside and saw that the compartment was smaller than expected, narrow but deep, designed not for bulk but for density. Inside were no personal effects, no clothing, no symbols of normal life. Instead, he saw the unmistakable geometry of wealth reduced to function. Gold bars stacked with precise efficiency, their surfaces dulled but unmistakable. They bore no markings, no national stamps, no serial numbers. Their anonymity was complete. Nearby, secured in padded sleeves, were small containers holding stones that caught the light even through layers of grime. Diamonds, selected not for beauty but for value per gram, for portability, for discretion. Alongside them lay a second folder, thinner than the medical records but heavier in implication. Its cover was plain, its pages bound with a care that suggested frequent handling. He removed it gently, knowing that paper this old, even protected, could be fragile. As he opened it, he felt the narrative of the trunk shift again, expanding beyond the life of a single man into the machinery that had required him. The documents inside were not explicit confessions. They did not declare crimes or name conspirators. Instead, they spoke in the coded language of bureaucracy, where meaning was distributed across references and omissions. Columns of figures aligned with dates that corresponded to significant events he recognized vaguely from memory. Transfers that did not list destinations, only intermediaries. Authorizations signed not by names, but by roles. The pattern was unmistakable. This was a financial shadow, a ledger of actions conducted outside formal oversight. He began to understand the scope of what he was seeing. The car had not simply transported a substitute. It had carried resources. It had functioned as a moving vault, a secure conduit for a fund that could not appear on any balance sheet. The gold and diamonds were not trophies. They were tools, designed to move through borders without triggering scrutiny, to buy cooperation where ideology failed, to ensure outcomes where persuasion could not. The presence of such wealth reframed the medical records entirely. The man described there had not been merely a decoy for public appearances. He had been an operational asset, a figure whose physical presence legitimized movements that would otherwise have drawn suspicion. His face, his posture, his existence had been leveraged to move money, to authorize transactions that required the As this realization settled, another followed with equal force. If the car had been used to transport both the man and the funds, then its disappearance marked more than the end of a role. It marked the termination of a system. Something had gone wrong, not in the abstract, but concretely enough to require erasure. He returned his attention to the medical documents, now viewing them through a different lens. The repeated procedures, the emphasis on recovery, the careful monitoring of stress. These were not acts of care, they were maintenance protocols. The man's body had been kept functional not for his sake, but to ensure the uninterrupted operation of the mechanism he supported. The later reports, with their cautious language and narrowing options, took on new meaning. The diminishing returns were not only medical, they were operational. A substitute could only endure so much before the risk of exposure outweighed the benefits of continued use. At some point, the system would have faced a choice: replace him or remove him. The absence of any transition documentation suggested the latter. He imagined the final phase not as a dramatic confrontation, but as an administrative conclusion. Decisions made in quiet rooms, justified with phrases about stability and necessity. The man, whose name existed only on paper, would not have been consulted. He would have been reassigned, relocated, retired in a way that left no trace. The car, having served its purpose, would have followed him into obscurity. The thought that this entire structure had depended on public belief unsettled him deeply. Not belief in a person, but belief in continuity. The assumption that leadership persisted unchanged, that appearances reflected reality. The substitute had not needed to be perfect. He had only needed to be sufficient. As he examined the financial documents further, he noticed that the final entries were abrupt. Transfers that ended mid-cycle. Authorizations that were never followed by confirmation. The flow of resources had stopped suddenly, as if cut off rather than concluded. This suggested interruption rather than completion. Something had forced the system to collapse inward, to bury itself. The gold and diamonds, left unused, reinforced this interpretation. If the fund had simply been shut down, its assets would have been redistributed, laundered, absorbed elsewhere. Leaving them behind implied urgency, fear, or both. The car had been sunk not as a routine disposal, but as an emergency measure. He felt the weight of this realization press against him, not physically, but mentally. The sea floor seemed closer now, the water heavier. He was no longer merely uncovering history. He was touching the residue of decisions made under extreme pressure, decisions that had favored silence over explanation. The man who never existed had been both indispensable and disposable. His life had been engineered to fill a void, then erased to preserve the illusion that the void had never existed at all. The car, stripped of its official narrative, had become his unmarked grave. He closed the folder and replaced it carefully in the hidden compartment, arranging the contents as he had found them. This was not an act of concealment, but of respect for the integrity of the record. He understood now that the truth here was not contained in any single document or object. It existed in the alignment of all of them, in the pattern they formed when viewed together. As he secured the panel again, restoring the trunk to its outward appearance, he felt a shift in his own role. He was no longer simply a witness. He had become a custodian of knowledge that did not want to surface. The seafloor had held it in silence for decades, not because it was forgotten, but because it was too destabilizing to be acknowledged. He glanced once more at the suitcase, at the ring, at the sealed medical records. They represented a life lived in shadow, a human cost absorbed quietly by a system that valued outcomes over individuals. The weight of that understanding settled into him, heavy and unyielding. As he prepared to close the trunk, he became acutely aware that the story did not end with the man's erasure. The financial apparatus he had uncovered extended beyond him, beyond the car, into networks that might still exist in altered forms. The truth he now carried was not static. It had momentum. He sealed the trunk gently, the metal settling back into place with reluctant finality. The car returned to its silent composure, its secrets once again hidden from casual view. But nothing had truly closed. The discovery had. As he backed away from the vehicle, his thoughts turned forward rather than backward. The man who never existed had paid the price for stability. The funds that had flowed through him had shaped events beyond his control, and now, decades later, the residue of those choices rested in the hands of someone who had never sought them. The question was no longer what had happened. It was, what should happen next? He remained motionless for a long moment after sealing the hidden panel, suspended in the water as if the weight of what he had learned required physical stillness to settle properly. The car no longer appeared as a singular anomaly. It had become a node in a system, one point in a network of movements, decisions, and transactions that extended far beyond the reach of the sea floor. What lay hidden inside it was not merely evidence of deception, but proof of circulation. Power, he understood now, did not only travel through speeches, laws, or visible authority. It traveled through routes that were never mapped, through currencies that left no trace, through hands that never appeared in official photographs. He reopened the concealed compartment, not out of doubt, but out of necessity. Understanding required repetition. He studied the gold bars again, their dull surfaces absorbing the beam of his light without reflection. Gold usually carried an aura, a sense of spectacle or temptation. But here it felt stripped of meaning, reduced to density and mass. Without markings, without provenance, it was wealth that could belong to anyone and therefore to no one. This was gold designed not to impress, but to move. He lifted one carefully, gauging its weight. Even through his gloves, the heaviness was unmistakable, compressing meaning into physical form. Each bar represented not luxury, but leverage. It could pass through borders, hands, and conflicts without explanation. It could purchase silence, accelerate cooperation, erase resistance. It was money that never needed to be justified because it was never meant to be seen. The diamonds reinforced that understanding. They were not large or ornamental. They were precise, selected for uniformity, for ease of concealment, for efficiency. They existed outside any cultural or emotional context. Their value was absolute, transferable, unquestioned. In places where currencies fluctuated and institutions failed, such stones retained their authority. They were the purest expression of transactional power. As he examined the financial documents again, the pattern revealed itself with greater clarity. The ledger did not record profits or losses. It recorded movements. Resources shifted from one point to another, facilitated by intermediaries whose names were either abbreviated or replaced by codes. The language avoided specificity, relying instead on consistency. Once the logic was understood, the meaning became unavoidable. This was not corruption in the casual sense. It was infrastructure. He recognized dates tied to moments he had once watched on screens without context, political crises framed as sudden, inexplicable turns, operations justified after the fact with vague explanations. The ledgers suggested that outcomes had been prepared long before they were announced. Money had flowed quietly ahead of events, shaping conditions so that when decisions were revealed publicly, they appeared inevitable. The realization carried an unsettling implication. The substitute, the man whose body had been maintained with such clinical precision, had been a visible anchor for invisible currents. His presence legitimized movements that were already in motion. The car had been the bridge between appearance and action, between the symbolic and the operational. This reframed the entire narrative of disappearance. The system had not only lost its figurehead, it had lost its conduit. Without the illusion of continuity, without a body to carry authority through space, the machinery could no longer function seamlessly. The abrupt end of the financial records reflected that collapse. Once the conduit was gone, the flow stopped. He began to sense the magnitude of danger embedded in this knowledge. These funds were not historical artifacts. They represented a method, a way of operating that could be revived, repurposed, or replicated. The individuals involved might have aged, retired, or died, but the logic remained intact. Anyone who understood it could attempt to rebuild it. The car, then, had been sunk not only to erase the past, but to prevent the future. By removing the physical nexus where identity, authority, and untraceable wealth intersected, those responsible had attempted to sever the system at its most vulnerable point. It was an act. That understanding shifted his sense of responsibility again. If the car had been meant to disappear completely, then its rediscovery was not neutral. It reintroduced a possibility that had been deliberately closed. The gold and diamonds were not merely valuable, they were catalytic. In the wrong context, they could resurrect structures that had been buried for good reason. He felt the pressure of choice begin to form, though it was still distant, still abstract. For now, he focused on documentation, capturing images, recording measurements, preserving evidence in the only way he safely could. Each action was taken with restraint, aware that excessive interference could destabilize what remained intact. Yet, even as he worked, a new awareness crept in. The dive no longer felt isolated. The silence of the sea floor began to feel conditional, as if it persisted only so long as no one else knew what rested here. He scanned the surrounding water again, not expecting to see another diver or a vehicle, but searching for signs of disturbance, of recent intrusion. There were none. Still, the sense lingered. He understood then that danger did not require proximity. Information traveled faster than bodies. The moment this discovery was reported, catalogued, or even hinted at, it would attract attention from places that did not operate within ordinary constraints. The gold and diamonds would speak louder than the story of the substitute ever could. Wealth without origin was an invitation. The thought unsettled him deeply. He had spent his career in environments where danger was tangible, measurable, pressure, entanglement, equipment, failure. This was different. This was danger that began with knowledge and spread through implication. There were no gauges to measure it, no procedures to neutralize it completely. He replaced the contents of the compartment once more, securing them with the same care he had used earlier. The act felt ceremonial now, a deliberate restoration of balance. The seafloor had preserved this archive because it could not move, could not act. By uncovering it, he had introduced motion again. That motion needed to be controlled. As he closed the trunk, sealing away both confession and currency, he felt the first stirrings of conflict within himself. There was a part of him that recognized the value of what he had found in purely material terms. Even a fraction of the wealth contained here could transform a life. But that thought passed quickly, leaving behind a sharper realization. This money was not neutral. It carried history with it, and that history was stained with erasure. He began his ascent slowly, not because his oxygen demanded it, but because his thoughts required the time. Each meter upward felt like a gradual re-entry into a world that would not understand what lay beneath it. The surface would ask for reports, for explanations framed in technical language. It would not ask for interpretation. It would not want to hear about systems that contradicted its narratives. As the car receded into the dimness below, it seemed to resume its role as silent custodian. But he knew now that silence was not the same as safety. The truth had weight, and that weight had begun to shift. By the time he reached the shallower depths, the question had sharpened into something unavoidable. The discovery was no longer about what had been done, or even about who had been sacrificed. It was about what should be allowed to continue. The money that was never counted had shaped history precisely because it had remained unseen. Now that it had been seen, the burden of choice was no longer abstract. It was descending toward him, heavy and unavoidable, as he moved closer to the surface where decisions could no longer be postponed. By the time he surfaced, the weight he carried was no longer confined to the pressure of depth or the strain of prolonged immersion. It had followed him upward, settling into his thoughts with a persistence that refused to dissipate in the open air. The ocean released him physically, but it did not release what it had entrusted to him. The truth, once encountered, behaved like a substance that could not be set down. It adhered, altered balance, demanded compensation. The deck of the support vessel felt unfamiliar beneath his feet. Sounds returned abruptly, sharp and intrusive, breaking the continuity he had inhabited below. Voices, machinery, the ordinary choreography of work resumed around him, yet he experienced it all as if through a thin barrier. He responded when necessary, performed the motions expected of him, but a part of his attention remained elsewhere, still hovering beside the car on the sea floor, still tracing the outline of decision. The initial debrief was procedural: coordinates, depth, condition of the site. He delivered what was required, omitting nothing that would compromise safety or violate protocol, yet offering no interpretation. The discovery of a large vehicle was noted, logged as an anomaly pending further assessment. No conclusions were drawn. No urgency was expressed. On the surface, the system functioned as designed, absorbing information without immediately assigning it meaning. That restraint, he understood, was temporary. In the hours that followed, subtle shifts began to register, requests for clarification that went beyond standard follow-up, questions framed casually, yet repeated with slight variations, as if testing for inconsistency. Interest that arrived without visible source. It was not overt surveillance, not yet, but it carried the unmistakable texture of attention that did not belong to routine operations. He recognized the pattern with unease. This was how interest announced itself before it became pressure. He reviewed his own records carefully, replaying moments of the dive, examining what he had documented and what he had chosen not to. The images of the car were unambiguous, but images alone told an incomplete story. They showed form, not function, presence, not purpose. Without context, they could be explained away as a historical curiosity, an administrative oversight, a forgotten artifact. It was the context that transformed the discovery into something volatile. The alignment of the medical records, the substitute, the untraceable funds. Together, they formed a narrative that challenged not a single decision, but an entire architecture of power. Such challenges rarely ended in accountability. More often, they ended in containment. He felt the first true edge of fear then, not for his safety in the immediate sense, but for his autonomy. Knowledge had shifted his position. He was no longer simply a contractor performing a task. He had become a variable and unpredictable element in a system that valued predictability above all else. As the days passed, the pressure intensified in quiet ways. His access to certain databases was delayed without explanation. Equipment requests that had once been approved automatically were rerouted for review. Conversations he entered fell briefly silent before resuming with forced normalcy. No one confronted him directly. No one needed to. The message was not spoken, but it was clear. He was being noticed. The moral conflict he had sensed beneath the surface now surfaced fully. The truth he carried did not resemble the ideals often associated with truth. It was not liberating. It did not promise resolution or justice. Instead, it presented a series of outcomes, each weighted with consequence. To reveal everything openly would fracture narratives that millions relied upon, not out of ignorance, but out of necessity. Stability was built on shared belief, and belief, once destabilized, did not reassemble neatly. Institutions would not fall gracefully. They would lash out, entrench, deflect. The damage would not be limited to those who had orchestrated the deception. It would ripple outward, touching lives far removed from the original acts. Yet to remain silent felt equally untenable. Silence would not erase what he had learned. It would simply allow the conditions that had made such a system possible to persist unexamined. Worse, silence could be interpreted as complicity. By choosing not to speak, he risked becoming another layer of concealment, another silent collaborator in a history of erasure. He considered alternatives: partial disclosure, controlled release, the creation of distance between himself and the information. Each option carried its own risks. Partial truths were often more dangerous than complete ones, inviting speculation without providing clarity. Distance could be misread as evasion. Control, once attempted, had a way of slipping from the hands of those who sought to impose it. The most unsettling realization was that the truth itself did not demand to be spoken. It had no moral imperative of its own. It simply existed. The responsibility lay not in its content, but in its handling. Like the gold and diamonds, truth could be catalytic. In the wrong context, it could empower the very forces it sought to expose. He returned repeatedly to the image of the car resting on the sea floor, silent and composed. It had not resisted its fate. It had accepted removal from circulation as the cost of preventing further damage. The substitute had not been granted that dignity. His life had been expended to maintain illusion. The system had chosen concealment over correction. Was there a way to honor that? The question haunted him. He found himself scrutinizing everyday interactions for signs of ulterior motive, reading too much into casual remarks, measuring silences. Trust became conditional, provisional. He understood then how systems of secrecy perpetuated themselves. They eroded the ability to distinguish threat from neutrality, turning every unknown into a potential risk. Late one night, alone with his notes, he reached a quiet conclusion. The truth could not be treated as a weapon, nor could it be buried entirely. It required a form of stewardship, not exposure for spectacle, nor concealment for safety, but placement. A way of ensuring that it existed beyond him, preserved accurately, yet insulated from immediate exploitation. This realization brought no relief, only clarity. He began to consider mechanisms rather than gestures, structures that could hold information without amplifying it, custodians rather than audiences, time as a buffer. He understood that such an approach would not absolve him of responsibility. On the contrary, it would bind him to a longer arc of consequence. But it offered something the other options did not: proportionality. The damage inflicted by the original deception had been disproportionate, sacrificing an individual to preserve an image. He would not repeat that error by sacrificing the present to correct the past. The pressure around him did not ease. If anything, it sharpened, as if those watching sensed his hesitation and grew impatient with it. He remained outwardly compliant, fulfilling his duties, offering nothing that could be construed as defiance. Internally, however, his course was set. The truth, he decided, would not be released into the world as an event. It would be anchored, preserved in a form that required deliberation to access. It would exist, undeniable and intact, but it would not be allowed to cascade unchecked through systems unprepared to absorb it. This choice did not feel heroic. It felt heavy, imperfect, necessary. He had not sought the role of arbiter, yet it had been assigned to him by circumstance. The ocean had revealed what it held, and in doing so had transferred custody. As he prepared for the final steps of that decision, he understood that the most difficult part was yet to come. Returning the car to silence, determining what should disappear and what should endure, would require action, not contemplation. The truth, once lifted, could not simply be dropped again without consequence. The dangerous cargo he carried was not the gold, nor the documents, nor even the story of the man who never existed. It was the knowledge that systems built on illusion did not collapse when exposed. They adapted. and whatever he chose to do next would shape not only the fate of a discovery, but the shape of what might follow it. The decision did not arrive with finality. It settled gradually, like sediment after a disturbance, each particle finding its place through patience rather than force. He understood now that any attempt to resolve what he had uncovered through a single decisive gesture would repeat the very logic that had created the deception in the first place. The system he had glimpsed had thrived on abrupt closures, on silences imposed quickly enough to prevent questions from forming. He would not add another such closure to the record. Instead, he focused on separation, not between truth and falsehood, but between consequence and impulse. The gold and diamonds were the most obvious danger, not because of their value, but because of their portability. They were leverage compressed into form, capable of reanimating structures that had been dismantled only by circumstance. Their continued existence in any accessible context was an invitation to repetition. The documents, by contrast, carried a different risk. They did not compel action by themselves. They required interpretation, patience, and a willingness to confront complexity. Their danger lay not in what they enabled, but in what they revealed. They were destabilizing only to narratives that depended on simplicity. He returned to the site under conditions that mirrored the first dive as closely as possible. Same vessel, same crew, same weather window. Familiarity was a form of camouflage. The ocean did not notice repetition, and neither, he hoped, would those whose attention had begun to brush against his work. The descent felt different this time, not because the environment had changed, but because his role within it had. He was no longer searching. He was concluding. The car awaited him with the same quiet composure, its outline unchanged, its posture unaltered by his earlier intrusion. It appeared almost patient, as if it had anticipated this return. He approached it slowly, aware that this encounter would be the last. There was no ceremony in his movements, no sense of. He opened the trunk once more and accessed the hidden compartment. The gold and diamonds were removed carefully, placed into containers designed for containment rather than transport. Their purpose now was neutralization, not recovery. He had arranged for their transfer into a process that would render them inert, stripped of anonymity, absorbed into systems where their origins would be examined rather than exploited. They would not vanish. They would be accounted for, transformed into something that could no longer circulate freely. This act did not feel like confiscation. It felt like disarmament. The documents required a different approach. He did not remove them. Instead, he duplicated them with precision, preserving not only their content but their context. Every mark, every sequence, every omission was recorded faithfully. The originals remained where they were, returned to their place within the car, shielded by depth and obscurity. The copies were sealed and entrusted to a framework designed to outlast individuals. Not a publication, not an exposé, but an archive bound by conditions. Access would require time, verification, and convergence. The information would not be released into a moment, but into a process. It would be there for those willing to approach it responsibly, for historians rather than opportunists, for institutions capable of absorbing nuance. It would exist without demanding attention, waiting instead for readiness. With these preparations complete, he turned his attention to the car itself. Its continued presence at the original site was no longer acceptable. The location had been compromised by discovery. Silence depended on depth, not secrecy, and depth alone was not immutable. He arranged for the vehicle's relocation, not to erase it, but to restore its function as a custodian, rather than a spectacle. The process was meticulous. The car was guided, not lifted, coaxed into a deeper pocket of the seafloor where sediment was thicker and currents slower. Additional weight ensured stability without violence. No markers were left behind. No trails were disturbed beyond what time would soon smooth over. When the car settled again, it did so as it had before, composed and final. As he watched it disappear into the dimness, he felt no triumph, only completion. The ascent that followed was unremarkable, and that was its greatest success. There were no interruptions, no unexpected signals, no sense of pursuit. The ocean accepted the reconfiguration without protest. The archive was closed, not sealed forever, but placed back into a context that demanded patience. In the days and weeks that followed, the world resumed its familiar rhythms. The heightened attention he had sensed faded gradually, redirected by other anomalies, other urgencies. Systems that thrived on movement grew bored with stillness. He remained careful, measured, but no longer felt the same proximity of threat. The truth, anchored as it was, no longer traveled with him. He returned to ordinary work, to dives that revealed nothing but corrosion and debris, to reports that described only what was expected. Yet, he was not unchanged. The knowledge he carried had altered his perception irreversibly. He watched public events unfold with a quieter skepticism, recognizing the architecture behind appearances without resenting it. He understood now that stability was not a natural state, but a maintained one, achieved through compromises that were rarely acknowledged. The memory of the man who never existed stayed with him most persistently, not as a symbol, but as a measure. A reminder of what systems demanded when continuity became more important than truth. The archive he had preserved ensured that this life would not be erased entirely. It would not be celebrated, but it would. From time to time, he thought of the seafloor as it had been before his discovery, an undisturbed ledger, indifferent and complete. It had been altered by his presence, but not diminished. If anything, its role had been clarified. It was not a grave. It was a repository holding what could not yet be integrated into the surface world. He understood then that not all truths were meant to rise immediately. Some required depth to remain intact. Some needed silence not to conceal them, but to protect what they would one day illuminate. What remained on the seafloor was no longer a threat. It was a record, waiting. And above it, life continued, shaped subtly by forces unseen, sustained by agreements rarely examined. He accepted this not as resignation, but as maturity. The ocean closed over the archive once more, unremarkable and complete, and, in its quiet persistence, it offered the only resolution such a story could honestly claim. If this story made you question what lies beneath the surface, don't stop here. Subscribe now to see the next videos and explore other stories that reveal what history tried to hide. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Some